Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Gibson, and Hans is joining me again tonight. He and I did a presentation a couple of months ago on Old World, New Hampshire, and Maine, and he's joining me again. He's got a very good eye for this information, and he emails me periodically with some things that he's found. In this particular presentation, he's put together a PowerPoint on cemeteries. Cemeteries come up quite a bit in my research, and I think they're going to keep coming up even more from some of the projects I've got waiting to work on in the future. And I know there's something to this subject. I don't have all the answers by a long shot, but tonight we're going to talk about some cemeteries that Hans has looked into specifically. And with that, I'm going to just see what you have that you want to add to what I said, and then we can go into your PowerPoint.
So cemeteries interested me quite a bit, and I never really got around to looking into them fully, but everything that we're about to show tonight was very quickly I found this stuff without even doing a very deep dive into it. And since you were on the subject of the New England area, these kind of fit right in pretty nicely. Basically, all of them except for the one in Maryland and maybe the one in New York City are all within like 2 hours of me. And funny enough, the way that I really got into these ones was I typed in what's the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery. And to me, a graveyard and a cemetery was always the same thing. But it turns out there is a difference. And so these ones are basically the first cemeteries in the United States. The thing that really caught my attention was that it fits right in with the mud flood timeline. I believe the first one that we look at is 1831, and it goes 1831, 1834, 1838, 1838 again, and then 1841, and then 1859. That kind of caught my attention right away. Like, imagine that. And then without looking too hard, the buildings around these cemeteries and then some of the monolithic features in them, it didn't make sense with the whole timeline to me. It fit right in with what you've talked about many times, but I don't know.
Yeah, I can add some to that. They've come up from time to time, and some of the interesting things about them is how the elite view them. They like the choicest mausoleum in the cemetery. They want to be buried in these obelisk kinds of things or pyramids, which is interesting. And then another interesting thing is that they want to keep themselves separate from everybody else. So the upper classes have their own section of the cemetery. And then I know with at least the first one here that you are showing, the Mount Auburn Cemetery, but probably all of them were part of the rural cemetery or garden cemetery movement. Are you going to be going into that, Hans?
That was interesting to me is like horticulture. They bring that up big time in these first few of them. It's like, and to me, horticulture and historical sound very familiar. So I thought that that was kind of interesting that like the horticultural society and historical societies kind of coincide right there.
It was like they were trying to make them into public parks.
Well, yeah, that's the thing that we'll see in part of this. If you want to read some of the clips as we go along, the parts where I put the paragraphs in, if you want to read some of those parts, but it's just very interesting and kind of stupid to me how it coincided and the public parks thing too. Like you and others talk about the first amusement parks and stuff, but when you start reading about some of these early cemeteries, they talk about them like, oh, it's a great public park to go to, and it just why like we don't treat cemeteries that way these days. It's kind of it's not like an amusement thing to go to. And then some of the paragraphs about it in here is they talk about the monuments and they talk about clearing away the trees or different vegetation and trying to make it look more pleasing to the eye for the public to come and view these stones and everything. And to me, it seems like once again is something that was refounded. And I don't know, that was the strangest thing to me was the horticultural part of it.
It's like for a 70-year period, they're telling us this was very popular, as you're saying. And then around the end of the 19th century, they were losing their popularity, and because of the high cost of maintenance of the parks and other public parks coming online, the plots were independently owned, so it wasn't a uniform appearance. These are some of the reasons that are given for why they went out of fashion. So it is a very interesting topic. I know there's a lot more to this that's hidden. Besides the attitude of the elites towards these cemeteries, the other thing is they tend to be in proximity to railroads, which I also find very interesting.
Here's the outside of the cemetery.
And they still have the trolley tracks there in front of it.
Yeah, trolley tracks are still everywhere.
So there's something there, and we can only guess, but I'm looking forward to your presentation, Hans, and I'm going to go ahead and go to the first slide and let you tell me what you found when you started digging into this subject.
Well, so this caught my eye, obviously, because here we got a Egyptian Sphinx looking monument, and they say it's a Civil War commemorative Sphinx. And right away, that was like red flags in my mind. Like, why in the hell would we have a Egyptian looking Sphinx as a Civil War monument? That doesn't make any sense to me. And it's massive. And just why? We're trying to show our independence in America, and we're going to represent it with a Sphinx.
And that was what they tended to do, was attribute things like this, apparently, and other old world infrastructure as memorials. There's a memorial Stonehenge in Washington State, the Maryhill Stonehenge. Perfect Stonehenge, like the one in England. It's in even better shape than that one. Clearly, in the case of the Sphinx here and the obelisk, that's an Egyptian motif. And like you say, why choose this?
Right. And to tie it in with the Civil War just really didn't make any sense. And once again, just the size of it and the skill that it would take to even do that is pretty amazing. And I didn't really put too many pictures of obelisks in this whole presentation, but you see them everywhere. In all cemeteries, it doesn't matter what size the cemetery is. That's one of the main things. And to me, in my mind, it was always, the richer people that died are the ones that got the big obelisk. But to me, it seems like they were already there.
As you're saying, the most important people in town got the obelisk typically. And with regards to the Sphinx, the Stanford Mausoleum in California also has sphinxes associated with it. Leland Stanford. He was an early robber baron associated with the railroad and major player in what took place here. Anything you can think to add before we move to the next slide?
We can just move on if you want.
So you did a little more digging.
Yep. So I forget what that says in the engraving on the side of it, but to me, that just shows the size of that, the size of that Sphinx. You can look at the pathway. That'd be hard to do today. And then I added that picture of the whole layout of the place because of the work that you do with like star forts and stuff. And a few slides later on, I showed another one, a different cemetery. But to me, it seems like things are laid out in a pretty particular way. And I figured that might catch your eye.
What comes to my mind right away is like it looks like a head of some kind, almost like a funny looking horse's head.
A horse head, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Where is Mount Auburn located?
It's in Massachusetts. So I'm in New Hampshire, the next state over Massachusetts, and I'm not exactly sure which part of Massachusetts it's in, but it's within 2 hours of me. And I've been born and raised, lived here my whole life. I've never heard anybody talk about this Sphinx in Mount Auburn Cemetery. You'd think that people would be like, oh, have you ever seen that? But again, people don't go to cemeteries to have fun, you go there to mourn for people. So it's interesting to read what they say about these and how they started out. They talk about them like it's a nice public park. Be great to see. And
take your family, go to the cemetery.
Right. And one of the next slides, it's like a pamphlet, and the title of it, it's, right there. A guide through Mount Auburn Cemetery, and it says, for the benefit of strangers. And it says clusters of monuments, and it's harder to read the stuff down below, but really that archway, which I see around here, I didn't add any of the ones from my area, but there's a couple of those big archways. There's a couple in my area, and they remind me of things you see all around the world. And on this one, it says that's an engraved plan of the cemetery. Like that was just the plan for it. But as you go along, that never changed. Like, they'll say a couple times that was the plan for it. And, obviously you see stuff like that all the time with these mud flood era buildings. It's like, oh, this was the plan. It could have burnt down, but then it's still the same freaking building. So they're acting like a drawn up sketch of what it was going to look like, but it's still like this to this day.
And a couple of interesting things that are coming to mind while you're talking. So what I can read is Guide Through Mount Auburn with 76 engravings for the benefit of strangers desirous of seeing clusters of monuments with the least trouble.
Yeah, that stuck out to me big time with the least trouble. So it was like, oh, these things are around, but you have to walk through big amounts of forest to find these old clusters of monuments. But this one, we have it all cleared out. So it's a nice place for you to go and see. And then the other slide, the kind of bird's eye view one at the bottom of it, once again, 1831 Mount Auburn Cemetery Plan. It says this is the supposed plan for that whole cemetery. To me, that's not a plan for it. That's something that they found. It was already there, in my view.
There's a couple of other things that I want to mention while we're on that topic. I think this is the same idea as when they show us blueprints for buildings, as if they were building from them, but I think they were actually drafting them or sketching them as they were, as they saw them, and presenting it as this is our blueprint for the building we're going to build, instead of we just sketched this out from something that was already there. And I think that's what the architects were actually doing, the ones that were credited with these monumental buildings with no experience. They were actually draftsmen.
I've gone down many rabbit holes, but as far as this whole mud flood theory, most recent reset timeline, it's the most interesting to me and the easiest one in my eyes for people to look into for themselves. They can look at their own town or their closest city and they can just look at it and think about, what would that take to build? And then when you look up the official narrative of what it took to build those buildings, like we were talking about, it's always a 1 or 2 year period of time. It's like, what the hell? And even that brochure, it says it's just an engraved plan of the cemetery. I'm assuming they still have like copper plaques on a rock saying this was the plan, and then you're looking at the actual archway that is still there, that's in the picture right there. Someone could have drawn that up and said, this is what we plan on making it, and yet it was already there, and it's still there today, which is the amazing part. It just reminds me so much of all these old buildings that you and others talk about with the whole mud flood thing, and I haven't heard many people go into the whole cemetery aspect of this, but as far as the whole timeline, and it reminds me exactly of the buildings that we talk about all the time. It's these cemeteries, so it makes you rethink cemeteries in general, especially when they have the big archways, kind of like Egyptian style. Or
because that's what they'll say. They'll say it's some kind of revival style. So for something like the gate and the Sphinx in different cemeteries, they would call it Egyptian revival style. And the other giveaway that jumps out from what you're talking about with the whole mud flood train of thought is the 1854 at the bottom. There was a lot going on in 1854 in the new narrative. I mean, a lot. So they're publishing all of their documents and all of their manuscripts to explain what's there. And that was a very important part of what they were doing. When they said they were building it, they were actually documenting it.
That's the funniest thing on the cover of that brochure or whatever that says, to the benefit of strangers.
Like, what exactly does that mean?
It's weird to me, like, okay, so this is new people being introduced to this area. That's what a stranger is, someone that's not from that area. So that one just kind of blew my mind a little bit, and I kept looking a little further into it. And it just coincides so well with the mud flood buildings and the whole reset theory stuff. And I was surprised. Like, I really sent you this without digging too deep into it, without getting too deep into the names of everyone that's claiming to be responsible for it. But I was like, oh my God, it's the exact same as when you look into these buildings and everything. I haven't heard too many people really talk about the whole cemetery factor.
And these are all great catches and points that you're making here. Unless you want to go into full-time research like me, when you start looking at the people like you're talking about, it gets really interesting really fast. Who is behind it? And a lot of hidden history falls out of the ether when you start looking at the people behind founding places, the big names. You start looking at the big name connections and you have a whole world open up in terms of what we're really talking about here. The idea that there were certain families and certain people that were involved in this, deeply involved. And they either had a lot of influence in whatever aspect of life they were involved in, whether it was business or education or you name it, or they're very wealthy. So they're the wealthiest and highest echelon. They put themselves up at the top and they did everything to cause separation, social classes and everything else between them and the rest of society, which I find very interesting because like they wanted the best of the best for themselves and just leave the rest of us with crumbs. In their mind, they were better than humanity, and yet they're not. They're definitely not. They're doing all kinds of horrible things. But they've taken the best for themselves, including the information you're bringing forward, the best cemetery locations and best plots, highest ground. It's really interesting when you start going down the rabbit hole.
It's really simple too, the words that they use. Like, you never think of it. Like, think of foundation. I understand that. Building has a foundation. And so when we think of the founders, we think of they found it. Now I can't even hear that word without thinking of it the way that you hear it now too. They founded it. They found it. And then Freemasonry. What is masonry? What is free? They just took credit for these buildings, which I think all your viewers would understand that. But it's such a simple thing that most people don't think of it throughout their whole life. Yeah, they founded it.
And what's coming to my mind is they don't care. They don't care that they've taken it and taken credit for things that they didn't actually build and passed it off like they did. They have no conscience, no remorse. And I looked into a cemetery in Indianapolis, very similar to this one. There's a poet named James Whitcomb Riley, and he gave the world Little Orphan Annie. And his gravesite is at the top of Strawberry Hill in the Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. So he's at the top of the cemetery. And if you look at his poem that was originally called Little Orphant, Orphant, not orphan, Orphant Annie, it's a really strange poem. His work is really strange. And why was this guy held up to high esteem anyway? That's not clear. And there's also a connection between him and the man who created Raggedy Ann and Andy. Well, we didn't think about it when we were kids growing up. They were dolls. But when you think of orphans, what kids during the same time period, this 1850s time period, when there's so many orphans everywhere, that they weren't taken care of properly, they were probably dressed poorly. So it seems like they're reflecting things back to us in our culture that have a meaning that we aren't aware of.
Right. So it's like the preemptive programming thing that we're aware of now when we look back at old cartoons or Andy the Orphan, like you were just saying. There's one cemetery that I don't think it's included in this, but Susan B. Anthony, there's a whole big article that she was buried in one of these cemeteries. I think it was another Mount Hope cemetery, which there's a few of them. But the thing that caught my attention was Susan B. Anthony's gravestone was nothing special, like everything else in this cemetery was massive and awesome and all sorts of cool stuff. And then a whole article about how Susan B. Anthony was here and who knows about the whole real story on that. But I was like, what a disrespectful thing. They could have come up with a better story.
Exactly. And that's another good point. I know when I've researched specific people that I've encountered at different places, sometimes the only thing I can find is a gravestone. And it's like you say, there's nothing special about it. It's like their name, born, died, and that's it.
And a very simple gravestone compared to everything else that was going on in that graveyard.
And is there even a body there? So there's the Egyptian style gate that you're talking about.
Like how they put that right in the title, Egyptian Revival Gateway. And again, that's the same one in the first slide. They said this is the plan for how we're going to make the entrance to the Mount Auburn Cemetery, but it was clearly already there. Chose these few because they kind of contradict themselves. Like, this is the plan, it wasn't there, now it is there, now it's still there. I think there was even one that said it was made out of wood and they tore it down and redid it with granite. I'm like, no, it was always made of stone. which reminds me of all the other similar mud flood type stories. It reminded me of the lighthouses, like even in that last video we were talking about on Matinicus, like, oh, they knocked down the old wooden lighthouses and put up the stone ones. It's like, no, that's the same stone ones that were always there. But you can't find any old pictures of the wooden ones. It's always stone every time you look at it, or anything you can find on it.
And I would think intuitively that granite is not the easiest stone to work with because of its hardness. That's another interesting thing. The image at the top of the gate on the left is called the uraeus, and it's the image of the winged sun disk with the two serpents on either side. It's Egyptian, and it's also connected to the idea of our connection with our higher selves, with the divine, higher consciousness. I just talked about that in my last video. Those are the kinds of symbols that seem to be in a lot of places that we don't really understand the meaning of it. But to me, it's about before the mud flood, the civilization that was here was working on becoming that level of consciousness where they were connected with their higher selves. It shows up in unlikely places.
And in this one, it says right there, Egyptian Revival Gateway, and it says that this is a illustration, 1834 lithograph of that. So in 1834, they decided it was very important to make a new Egyptian style gateway to a cemetery,
And what they tell us about what we were capable of in 1834 in our narrative was pretty low tech. We're not to the Industrial Revolution yet. We're barely out of the American Revolutionary War, agrarian society. So they're doing these incredible feats of engineering. At the same time, they're telling us we were pretty low tech. That's one of the places the narrative starts to crumble. Another thing that's popping out at me is the name Oakes Ames. And I've talked about Oakes and his brother Oliver Jr. quite a bit, because they were heavily involved in the Union Pacific Railway, and they were co-owners of the Ames Shovel Shop. And the Ames Shovel Shop was started by their father, Oliver, in Easton, Massachusetts in 1803. And 1803 seems to mark the beginning of things like the Louisiana Purchase, and the DuPont set up their company in Delaware the year before in 1802 to manufacture gunpowder and explosives. And these guys are setting up their shovel shop, and that the Ames Shovel Shop was instrumental in opening the West. Well, if you're going to build a railroad, which is what they're saying because of the connection with the Union Pacific Railroad, how is this shovel going to be your most important tool?
I've seen that also, and it just adds up to the whole digging out period. Why was the shovel such a great invention, or not even an invention, but mass produced to an extent? There's a lot of digging out to do.
Exactly. And that's what they were doing. And so Oliver Jr. was the president of the Union Pacific Railroad, and Oakes, mentioned in this article, as the president of Mount Auburn from 1834 to 1863. He was in Congress, and he was notorious for being implicated in what's called the Credit Mobilier scandal. And it's exactly the same thing that you hear about today with the insider trading in Congress and the corruption, that he and other people in Congress were involved in this scheme around money and the railroad, and it blew up. And he was censured by Congress, Oakes Ames was, and he died, I want to say it was 1870-ish time period. It might even have been 1873. And he was exonerated by the Massachusetts state legislature for his role in the scandal about 10 years after he died. And there's the Ames Memorial, same thing. This is in Wyoming, and it's a pyramid for these brothers. And it was said to have been designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, which was another one of these architects that was credited with all this monumental architecture that had no training, which was pretty typical. These guys had a whole bunch of buildings under their belt. And then the Ames brothers had towns named for them, like Ames, Nebraska, and Ames, Iowa. And they're really shady characters at best, especially Oakes, with his involvement in this scandal. And yet they're honored hugely. And that's another strange thing when you start looking at these people that are involved and the ones that are held up in our society. They're sketchy at best.
And what they take credit for, you can just look at Wikipedia, and if you see things the way that we see it and many others do, I mean, it doesn't add up, especially when they have so many different buildings or whatever they take credit for. It's like there wasn't enough time for you to even do that. But that's interesting, though, the whole Ames name, because here in New Hampshire and in New England, Ames, before like Walmart was even a thing, Ames was kind of a Walmart when I was a kid. And they went out of business probably like 20 years ago, but Ames was like a big store. When I was a kid, it was like before Walmart was a thing. You go into Ames as a kid, it was exciting because you get whatever the hell you wanted in there, all sorts of stuff. So I kind of forgot about that until you were just talking about it. But I don't know if you ever remember Ames's from way back in the day. Some people used to call it Ames's.
I don't. They didn't have them where I grew up, but I'm going to have to add that on my list of things to look into. My feeling would be it's probably the same family. If not brothers, maybe cousins or once or twice or thrice removed, something like that. Probably one of those names.
That picture too I just thought that was kind of interesting too. It says the lot planting plans, the blueprint. I just thought that almost looked, again, they're talking about like horticulture on that blueprint thing, but it almost looks electrical to me, especially the three different circles with like the spikes coming out of them. But it kind of looks like a big circuit the way they have that all laid out for how they had the plants.
I now see the Olmsted name, and that's another red flag for me. Frederick Law Olmsted, and then his sons after that were also landscape architects. And I know for a fact that Frederick Law was heavily involved in the reset. And then the Olmsted brothers were supposedly involved in designing world fairs and things like that. So they were involved in that too. But like you said, with the wording of benefit of strangers, the way they have that worded, collection of lot planting plans, blueprint, and graphite on trace paper. And I don't know what ND stands for, but that's interesting wording too. I mean, that's pretty specific.
Yeah, and the way that it says that, makes it sound like there's different blueprints of different areas like this, but this is the only example that I saw, and I didn't look any further into it.
Almost like they traced it from something else, the way that that's worded with pencil. I'm guessing that's what graphite is on trace paper.
Like blueprint and trace paper, that in graphite obviously is like pencil, but it reminds me of blueprints, and you have trace paper. It just kind of like having anything where you got three copies that when you write on one, it all copies onto the other part. I still thought it was a little interesting, and it looked like an electrical thing a little bit, and just back to the horticulture thing. And
it does. And we know we're looking at something significant. It's just like, what'd they do, man? We know they did something. So it looks like you looked into founding versus founded.
Right. So again, that's that same gateway, Egyptian revival gateway, that one of the first slides, it said that they planned it. It was just a drawing of it. And here it still is. And again, it mentions the Horticultural Society founded Mount Auburn in 1831. That middle picture really kind of got me because they talk about how they wanted to make it easily accessible for people to see the stones in the beginning, 70-something stones for strangers to see. And they're talking about like gravestones basically. But this middle picture, it looks like everything is very overgrown.
And how they describe this is interesting. I mentioned the rural cemeteries at the beginning, but this says Bostonians founded Mount Auburn in 1831 for both practical and aesthetic reasons to solve an urban land use problem created by an increasing number of burials in the city, and to create a tranquil and beautiful place where families could commemorate their loved ones with tasteful works of art in an inviting and natural setting. The public flocked to the new cemetery, and Mount Auburn quickly became the model for the American rural cemetery movement, recognized as one of the most significant designed landscapes in the country, and was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1975.
Right. So to me, that is very strange. Like, what came first? People dying and having to find a place to bury them and putting stone monuments, or like what you just read there? Like, what's more important? What came first? Burying dead people or finding this place that seems like a cool area to bury dead people, but it seems like it was already very aesthetically pleasing, especially once they trimmed down all the stuff. And that's where the horticulture part comes in. I think one of the slides coming up too also talks about that. That is a big common theme with all 4 or 5 of these cemeteries, is they're horticultural, like very new. And the reason why I wrote the founding and founded is because it gives different reasons in these 3. It's like, wait a minute, did you found it? Are you saying you founded it like we're going to start a cemetery here? Or you actually found something that was already here? And they kind of go back and forth. And then when you see all the vegetation, like in the middle one, not just vegetation, like full-blown trees, and there's people dressed up pretty nicely walking amongst these trees, almost looking like they're walking into a jungle, and this is in Massachusetts. And then they got the Egyptian revival gateway going into it. So it's all really weird to me. And then the third picture all the way over, that's just a very common design that you see nowadays. And the very last slide of this whole presentation shows Oxford University, and the whole center of that place is a big version of what you see in that picture, which I understand. If you got a big field, if you want to have different pathways and you got big buildings going around, it does make sense to have 4 points that come into a circle so you can get to this end in that building from this way and that way. I understand why you would do it that way, but it seems like there was much more of a meaningful purpose to it when it was first designed. And you see that everywhere, like around the world.
It reminds me a little bit of a labyrinth. I don't think that's what that is, but that's what I think of when I see that. Cemetery gardener. What's that?
I thought that was funny too, and you could kind of explain that away as a photo opportunity. So that's why he was dressed up in his Sunday best, or whatever you want to call it. But it ties in with a lot of these old photos, and he's got the little top hat looking thing. What kind of gardener is really wearing that type of clothing for gardening? I can understand he's getting his picture.
That's almost like a suit and tie back in the day. You'd expect the gardener to be dressed for getting down in the dirt, digging around.
Right, I wouldn't have that many layers on. I can understand if it's a once in a career photo, sure, I'll get all dressed up like that. But as far as depicting that as your average gardener, and supposedly he's one of the head gardeners.
In that background, I don't know if it's just me, but that background looks fake to me.
That looks more like South Carolina.
Palm trees, but I can't think of what they're called, but yeah.
Born and raised in New England, I've never seen a leaf like that up here. Seemed a little strange to me. Moving on to the castle, that reminded me so much of a lighthouse.
Me too.
Their description of it and how it got there and everything just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit into place. It just reminds me of something else that was founded, not built. As you move on, it's going to show the inside of that castle that reminds me of a lighthouse, and it describes how smooth the granite blocks are inside and out, and perfectly so. Each block is rounded on the inside and the outside, and it still stands today. As far as I read that, I mostly just showed older pictures of the stuff, but there's newer pictures of it as well.
And just in reading the text above the picture of the lighthouse, it says, in the 1870s, an emphasis on open space and a more park-like nature to the cemetery, coinciding with the development of America's public parks, resulted in smaller lots, fewer monuments, and the removal of curbs and cast iron fences. In his early account of the cemetery, The History of Mount Auburn, Jacob Bigelow, the founder of Mount Auburn, recommends the removal of over half the trees in order to create broad vistas and open spaces through which the works of art could be seen, and the light of the sun might be admitted to the grass and cultivated flowers. Strange.
That's the part that I was looking for. So much in that sticks out to me, but the removal of wrought iron fences, which to me, a few years ago, I wouldn't have thought much of that. But now that you've had your video on like some of these iron bridges and things, and I wouldn't have thought that would be old world stuff, but now I'm starting to wrap my head around that. And when they talk about getting rid of the wrought iron fences, it seems like they're getting rid of some of the antiquitech or something that had a function. Why would they get rid of that? And then he's also talking about clearing away vegetation and trees and plants and stuff. So what's that remind you of? They found something and they're trying to clear stuff away so you can see these stone structures or whatever. It's not like you built something and then it got overgrown and you let it go. Oh, we forgot to trim this up for 20 years, so now we gotta go all out to trim it back. It's like, no, you found this and you're cutting down all the vegetation to expose these cool things, and then you're taking the claim for building the stuff that you found. But
yeah, I mean, it's very strange wording, and it's almost like they're providing justification for whatever it is they're trying to do with this narrative to explain its existence. And then we got rid of half the trees so you could see everything and the sunlight could come in and shine on everything else that's still there. Then we got rid of nature to do that.
Back to the horticulture thing too, they kind of talk about this. I'm having a hard time reading all this stuff. That's why I included a lot of the stuff in here, is because part about the whole horticulture thing, and they're kind of just talking talking about how they chopped down a bunch of stuff and they wanted to like make it look more neat.
And that was the reason they gave for the decline of these rural cemeteries. And they were also called garden cemeteries. It's like, oh, high maintenance costs. And all of these people had their own thing going on with their family plots. It was too irregular in its appearance. And the public parks were coming in, and so we're done with this. So like for 70 years, this was popular, and then, oh, we're going to change speeds here. It is very interesting, and I'm glad you brought this forward. That looks like that's worth a dive.
That's a newer picture of it, and then an older sketch of it, but it's all the same tower at Mount Auburn, and it reminds me of the lighthouses big time too. There's a lot of lighthouses that look very similar to that.
It's a 62-foot granite tower with a granite platform at its base and stairs leading to the entrance. It's 25 feet in diameter at the bottom and 15 feet in diameter at the top. It's hard to get the perspective of size. I'm guessing that's huge. If you go in there, it just dwarfs, and it kind of dwarfs the people that you see here in this sketch, little ants compared to the tower. It's sitting on top of an earthwork.
Horse and buggy people sketched in there, and then it shows how the land is kind of terraced, like dug away. They have that stairway, which seems to still be there today, but I would guess that the stairs are newer than that tower. The way it's dug away, too, it just reminds me of so many other buildings and things you see.
I would love to see how big that thing is in person. The other thing is the earthwork. There's a connection with earthworks and mounds to the grid system. And so you see railroad tracks built for long distances on top of an earthwork like that. It's intentionally built. I've seen them in a lot of different places, Montclair and Baltimore, which was Charles Carroll's mansion. He was another major player in all of this. Cahokia looks like that, the mound across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Cahokia Mound. So it's that idea, even with the steps. It's not just built on land, it's built on top of terraformed land, intentionally constructed like that.
If you want to read some of that.
For the design of Mount Auburn, Bigelow and Dearborn found inspiration in the English picturesque landscape, where summits and towers were commonly featured. Historian Blanche M.G. Linden notes that the cemetery's topography was ideal for creating a landscape in the English fashion, a standard feature of which was a mount or high point. Often a temple, pavilion, or tower was built atop of it, providing a place for contemplation of the sublime, deemed inherent in distant horizons. So again, they're saying they built it. They're the ones that built it. It wasn't there before, nor were these other places with the temples and pavilions with the English picturesque landscape. And it goes on to say, Bigelow described the historical associations of the tower as an English Norman revival structure that was built on the general plan of some of the round towers of the feudal ages and contains a gallery, battlements, Gothic windows, and a spiral staircase of stone. He praised the construction of the tower in which the stones are smooth, hammered on both sides, so that each stone makes a part of both the inside and outside surface of the wall. The horizontal surfaces of all the stones being level and true, it is impossible that any structure of the same materials should be more substantial.
I love that part. I wanted you to read that part because hammered. Stones are smooth hammered on both sides. This is that same tower. They already said it's a 65-foot tall granite tower, 25 feet at the base, 15 feet in diameter at the top. And they say that it was smooth hammered on both sides. I've never heard anyone talk about granite blocks being smooth hammered like that. I thought that was pretty telling.
It's all very interesting. The terms they use, like contemplation of the sublime, trying hard to convince you of what they're telling you and the purpose for all of these. But they also, like you said, which the founders named Mount Auburn here, they found it. They're telling us that. But they're also telling us at the same time that we actually built this.
Yeah, this is where it really started getting interesting to me. Here we go with these old Gothic revival style buildings with the big rose window and the towers that seem to have antiquitech. And Mount Auburn Cemetery is either in Watertown or right by Watertown. I forget, one of your last videos, you brought up Watertown as a significant place in Massachusetts. So it's either in Watertown or right by it. So I thought that was interesting. And I mean, this is just a classic example of a building that shouldn't be there for 1831.
Looks very out of place.
Right, and you remember reading a few slides back how they got rid of the wrought iron fencing, and I think they even said some of the like granite curbing or something, so you can see that like granite curbing and some of the wrought iron fencing around this that probably isn't still there today. And then in the next slide, I wrote above it that the entryway seems to have changed. So you see how in the old picture a double door with another like smaller round window above the two double doors, and that seemed to have been changed, and they added steps and made the door just the one door that splits apart and comes to a nice arch, but they got rid of that round part above it. And the rose window, or whatever you want to call it, to me, in the newer picture with the steps, the window seems different to me. And I've heard other people talk about how sometimes the stained glass windows, that might have been a replacement. They're getting rid of the old Antiquitech. So the older picture, that to me seems more like some sort of metal framing in between the windows. It seems like the whole building had some sort of purpose for creating energy. But the one with the new door, if you look at the window, it doesn't seem like it has that same metal framing in between. It seems like they changed that. Plus, they got rid of the round window in between or above the door. And it still kind of has those little power prod things, whatever you want to call them. But to me, it seems like something that used to create power, they disabled the power and changed it.
It's possible that it was modified that way, but I just don't give them credit for being able to replicate that style of architecture. They take credit for it, but I just don't know that they could create with the same beauty that the original builders did. But they seem pretty good at bricking things up.
No, to me, that just kind of reminded me of how you see bigger doors that used to be big doors where some people are like, were people bigger back then? There's stairways going up to it. I said it quite a bit. The picture, to me, the newer looking one, it looked like it was the same, but the columns definitely looked different. And it just seemed like it was modified.
They absolutely did that. They did change things. They took towers down and all kinds of things. Steeples. The other interesting thing is you've got the Egyptian going on here too with the obelisk in front of it, like we were talking about. So now we're in Maine.
Yeah, and this one kind of just, I don't necessarily know what to think about that little castle thing, but obviously that's a pretty newer picture of it. And there's a lady walking to give you an idea of the size of it, but to me, it seems like it goes deeper down to the ground, and they call that a Civil War monument as well. So that's why it stuck out in my mind also. It's just another Civil War monument.
And that was my thought. There's more of that underneath.
Right, and you can see it. Skip ahead one more. I like this one. So you can obviously, if you look at the brickwork, you can see that it keeps going down in a weird way. But what I really liked about this one is I was always taught that those notches in the top of the castle was for either the cannon to be shooting through that spot so you could, hide. You could be shielded, whether you using a cannon or even bow and arrow. That's what those notches was for, so you could protect yourself as you were shooting. But this picture, Civil War monument, that cannon on top they didn't even put it in a notch. It's sitting on top of the wall for why those notches were even there at the top of the castle. So I just thought that was stupid. That's why I included it.
Also, the skinny windows are very much like what you see with lighthouses and other architecture I've seen. When I was in the Balkans a couple of months ago, we took a tour of a huge star fort in Novi Sad in Serbia. There's miles and miles of tunnels, brick tunnels underneath. The tour guide was well versed in what we're told it was for, which was for putting weapons down and firing, but it made no sense. I mean, they were long, narrow windows. And even if that was true, I mean, somebody would just be sticking a musket down there and not even seeing their target because you can't see the other side. So it's like these stories just fall really flat. I'm thinking there's some kind of energy or frequency function to these windows that are shaped like this. They're serving some kind of purpose, like the turret at the top, like you're saying, not for cannon, even though they try really hard to make us believe that.
Do you see how that cannon is resting on top of the high point instead of in the notch?
Sure do.
That just made me laugh. And then I wrote the symbolic numbers part because it says the land was approximately 660 by 3,300 feet. And to me, I just, how the sixes and threes numbers goes, but I just thought that was kind of funny that they chose that for an approximate 660 by 3,300.
Yeah, that's definitely another thing of theirs. Now, numbers in and of themselves are a key to the universe, like the 369 and Tesla.
But if you understand 3, 6, and 9, you understand the keys to the universe.
So the beings behind this inverted that, and they like to use numerology with everything, but not to help people, for the opposite. So they're doing some kind of negative spell casting or enchantment or something with their use of numerology. But numerology in and of itself isn't bad. It's just what meaning you attribute to the different numbers that you're using. Dates, years. They do certain rituals on certain dates. So you see a lot happening on like March 22nd is one of them, 322. And that was also a number that was associated with the Skull and Bones Society at Yale, which was a fraternal secret society there.
All the presidents were part of the Skull and Bones. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people. Same people we've been talking about. Same families.
Which kind of funny at the bottom of this too. It says the cemetery includes the grave sites of Hannibal Hamlin. Hannibal is his first name, apparently. Hannibal Hamlin, a U.S. vice president. Doesn't say which year. I've never heard of him. And he had also held office as congressman and a U.S. senator and governor of Maine. First name Hannibal.
Hannibal Hamlin is one of the statues for Maine in the National Statuary Hall.
Oh, yeah, you've looked into that quite a bit.
Yeah, and I found a lot of information. You start looking at the individuals that are held up, they tend to be the heroes of this reset. And so Hannibal Hamlin was one, and then the other one was William King. And you start looking at what they were involved in. King for sure was a Freemason and all the things he was doing in the early history of Maine. Again, there's a lot of information you can find when you start looking at people. And I kind of remember Hannibal Hamlin because when I was a kid, my dad was an elementary school vice principal, and I got a set of encyclopedias that were at one of the libraries at one of the schools that he was at was tossing out. So I would sit in my bedroom and read encyclopedias. That was probably like a teenager when I was doing that. And it seems to me I learned a lot of random stuff was doing that.
Got you started on your digging deep.
Yeah, I was a different kind of kid. So this is Greenmount Cemetery in Maryland.
You said you're from Maryland, right?
Mm-hmm. And I don't think I know anything about this.
I was wondering if you'd heard of it because I thought I remembered you said you were from Maryland, and that's part of why I included it was because it's one of the first. I think it says 1838 in this one. So they say Mount Auburn was first official cemetery like that. But again, a very old world building, founded 1838.
It's too bad I wasn't awake to this when I lived in the Baltimore area. I attended college right outside of Baltimore, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So I was actually in Catonsville, which is a suburb of Baltimore. But I wasn't awake to this at the time at all. But let's look at the gate here again, and it looks very similar to the Mount Auburn gate.
I think the next slide shows it more, and you can tell where they tried to fix it. It just makes me laugh because they tried to fix it. You can see how well we do our patchwork. We definitely built that, and we can't even do a decent job making it look good, just trying to keep it standing. They couldn't even fake it.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. You've got like cathedral kind of windows here. You've got the archway. You've got two towers here, twin towers. That's a style you see a lot of at universities. The same idea. So this is interesting. Again, it almost looks like that's the top of something. Like you're missing the rest of the building.
I'm pretty sure that building is the same one in the background there. The tree's kind of blurring it, but if you look at the top of that building, I think that is the same building that you see in that other picture. It's just further in the background.
I think you're right. I wonder who that is.
Yep, I just threw that one in there because I wonder sometimes if that was added after the stonework.
This sculpture doesn't even look like it's made out of stone. It looks like it's made out of something else. So yeah, I would say added afterwards.
And whoever put it there, kind of symbolic of how sad it was that whatever these structures were here for originally and whatever reset happened, it was depicting how sad it was for mankind, for humankind.
This is a Greenwood in Brooklyn. Greenwood Cemetery is a 478-acre, which is 193-hectare cemetery in the western portion of Brooklyn, New York City. The cemetery is located between the South Slope / Greenwood Heights, Park Slope, Windsor Terrace, Borough Park, Kensington, and Sunset Park, and lies several blocks southwest of Prospect Park. Its boundaries include, among other streets, 20th Street to the northeast, 5th Avenue to the northwest, 36th and 37th Streets to the southeast, Fort Hamilton Parkway to the south, and McDonald Avenue to the east. I think Fort Hamilton is a star fort on one side of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in Brooklyn, and then there's a star fort on the other side of the bridge in Staten Island. I want to say that's Fort Wadsworth. Greenwood Cemetery was founded in 1838 as a rural cemetery in a time of rapid urbanization when churchyards in New York City were becoming overcrowded, described as Brooklyn's first public park by default long before Prospect Park was created. Greenwood Cemetery was so popular that it inspired a competition to design Central Park in Manhattan. as well as Prospect Park nearby. And that's where Frederick Law Olmsted enters the scene. And Calvert Vaux, Vaux, have been credited with the design of Central Park. But that was Olmsted's entryway into landscape architecture. And then he had a long storied career with all of these places all over the place that were credited to him. And he was also involved in other aspects of the reset. He was a journalist, and he's tied into this whole narrative from the beginning as a player in what happened. I think the Civil War was definitely not what we've been told, and that there was a small group of people who were members of this private membership association, the Century Association, and then there was another one that they were involved in, the United States Sanitary Commission. Same people, basically, that seemed to have a lot going on with regards to the Union side, especially of the Civil War. So there's a lot tied up in that story, a lot going on in New York City in the same area. So let me look at the other side. I wish I could see some of the pictures a little bit better. So you've got the Gothic Revival entrance here on the left side. My attention's drawn down to that picture in the middle, which is a memorial to, is it Hezekiah Pierpont and his family? It was said to have been built in the 1840s. That looks pretty old world. And then you've got the founding and construction. Following the founding of Mount Auburn Cemetery in Massachusetts in 1831, leaders of New York City and its borough, Brooklyn, began discussing locations to build a cemetery of their own. That's catching on. At the time, over 10,000 people were being buried per year in the two cities. And so here we go. The cemetery was the idea of Henry Evelyn Pierpont, a Brooklyn social leader. And as early as 1832, Pierpont was considering constructing such a cemetery on a hilly area to the east of Gowanus Bay. And we've got the Acts of Incorporation for the Greenwood Cemetery passed in April of 1838. And that's interesting, and I don't know what that means. Entitling the corporation to a capital of $300,000 and the right to 200 acres of land. So why are they creating a corporation? That's like giving it the legal status of a person. That's what they were doing for dead people. That's what they were doing to cities and businesses and things like that, incorporating them into their new legal system. What were they doing?
The middle one also says something about the Battle of Long Island on August 27th, 1776, a Revolutionary War monument by Frederick Oxtel.
Again, they were giving context and meaning to what they found.
Just all strange to me, and that just ties in so much with all the other weird stuff that is going on from late 1700s to early to mid 1800s. The subplan says for Greenwood Cemetery. I also thought that was interesting. Whenever I see these like plans or bird's eye view type things, it reminds me of kind of the research you do, and it stands out. A little Starfordish. I don't know if that's just because the plan work on the papers, but symmetrical with the point and everything.
And then the names of some of these places. New York has a lot of kill in the name. And then you have names like Gravesend when you look around maps of New York City. Gravesend, to send to your grave. Another thing is these four-petal designs here in the gate look identical to atomic waveform patterns. And it's my belief that the civilization that built this was perfectly scientifically and musically tuned. So we're talking about frequencies. But I also think that the frequencies were working together somehow, because you see the same kinds of things in buildings that have been identified as churches and cathedrals. But you also see them in train stations, the same kind of cathedral rose windows. The big, massive Union stations look like cathedrals. So I think this type of design in the architecture had something to do with maintaining form and function.
I think that's what caught my eye also. I know exactly what you're saying with that, but just the peaks on all these little towers is almost identical to the last three buildings in the other cemeteries. I grew up here and, that's like a lightning rod thing. They did that to ground electricity. And I started thinking more about it and what Tesla was doing, and just when people talk about antiquitech, it's funny that we called it lightning rod. So it's like we had an understanding that like electricity was hitting those rods, but we were taught that was just so it wouldn't burn the building down, so it would go down through the structure and hit the ground. But when you see, especially some of the old world fairs, when you do get footage where the buildings are lit up, it's like, well, yeah, that is what it was for. It was catching the free electricity, and that's what it was there for. And somehow we dismantled, whether purposely or whatever cataclysm or reset type things happened, but I'd say purposely a lot of things were dismantled.
And I can't help but think that there's more to that structure as well, and probably the other gates, that there's more underground. And I think there's way more underground than we can imagine. I think what we see is as hills and the crazy way things are built. I think something rippled through the earth and created that displacement. I want to call it like a standing wave of some kind. And they just built on top of it. But it's probably what the Masons were doing. They just came in and they put roads over and made things serviceable again. But to me, that looks like there's more going on below the surface as well. In London, there's the Prince Albert Monument. I'll show a picture of it, and it looks like the top of a building, the same style of buildings that we're talking about. We're told it was meant to be that way. It was built to be that way, but it still looks like the top of something. In this next slide, we have on the left Richard Upjohn's memorial to Hezekiah Pierpont and his family that was said to have been built in the 1840s.
Yep, that also looks like there's a lot more underneath it, and the one in the middle is very interesting. The one all the way to the right doesn't look as fancy as old, but you can see it has the same features, and it made me laugh because it's called the Visitor Center.
Yeah, so that would be at a Star Fort, Fort Hamilton. You've got the wrought iron up here at the top. You were talking about that earlier, where it was removed at Mount Auburn as being antiquitect, looking at it with new eyes. You've got the double columns here, and that's a common architectural feature. More wrought iron fencing here to the side. In this middle one, you've got the obelisks and the columns, the cathedral style windows, those onion domes here. And then the same thing here with the arches and the columns. I'll have to take a look at that, but I can find something showing that that's a Moorish lobed arch here, called a Moorish lobe arch. That's who I think built everything, the Moors. And they were keepers of the Egyptian mysteries and explains the Egyptian connection that we're seeing here. And that it was all part of a worldwide civilization that's just been completely removed from our awareness. Because
Right.
700 years in Spain and that's it.
That makes sense to me more too now. I'd heard of the Moors, but you pieced it together for me. And I mean, a lot of people talk about Tartaria and say all these are Tartarian type buildings, but I don't know if there's a connection with the Moors and Tartarians or whatever, but it seems like the whole Moors civilization is what a lot of people call Tartarian style buildings.
It was all part of the same civilization. So Tartaria was like Asia, that part of Africa, northern Africa, where Egypt was Barbaria. The Washita Empire was here in North America. The Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Mughal Empire, they were all part of the same civilization. And that's just all been separated out and fragmented out. And we've been taught they were fighting and different things going on. And I don't believe that. I think this was a beautiful, harmonious civilization. And that got turned on its head. And then we were given a brand new narrative. And so part of what we're looking at is the dates, like you said, the 1830s. The 1830s was like when it was really getting up and running. They were starting to layer things into the narrative to explain things. 1840s and the 1850s was another level of ratcheting it up, and then a lot going on in the 1870s, 1890s, 1910. If you start looking at clusters of events and things happening, those are key years. 1830, 1850, 1870, 1890, 1910, especially as far as this narrative goes. So they're getting all their explanations in order. Who did what? And that's where it really starts to fall apart. And when they had control of the narrative, they could get away with it. Before the internet, I mean, we wouldn't have the ability to do this kind of research on our own. They would have control of the books and what we learn about in school, which they still do to a certain extent, but there's been this explosion of information and the tools for people to do their own research. And that's where they lost control of the narrative, and that's where the narrative falls apart.
Yep, that's what I see too. They got away with it for about 3 generations, but because of the internet, and then once you start to look at buildings like what we're looking at right now, I mean, we're talking about New England right here, but especially when you look out west and across America, it's like they told us it was nothing but wild Indians, and and then it was the Wild West, and it all just falls apart when you look at buildings all across America. It's easier to explain away over in Europe and across the world. Like, oh, well, they had hundreds of years ahead of us on that. But what we were taught in school absolutely doesn't hold up when you look at these buildings. And when you look at how long they say it took them to build, and they have no proof of building them. They just have a little sketch and say, well, that was the plan. It's like, well, I'm pretty sure they sketched up what was already there.
And that's what it'll say a lot of times. Edward Blore, Blore, was credited with this beautiful Moorish style architecture in the Crimea, and he's called an antiquarian draftsman. They're calling them draftsmen. They're giving credit to these guys that don't have any, admittedly, aren't architects, yet they are like geniuses, natural geniuses at this stuff. It's interesting when you start scratching the surface.
It gets laughable once you start seeing it, especially the explanations for it. And like you're saying, whatever guy's name you were saying, but sometimes you can get on a run of this one guy is accredited for at least several different buildings in the same 2-year time period. And he wasn't even an engineer or a builder or whatever. He just got a name for it. It just doesn't add up. It's funny to me that people can't see it, but I understand because I didn't see it until I really started thinking about it.
And there's lots of examples of people that have been credited, like you're talking about, with all these buildings, no experience, amazing work. And then it's almost like as they were repopulating and rebuilding, they were just like having a beer. Okay, you get this one, this one, and this one. I mean, it really feels like that to me with a lot of these examples.
And not only that, they kind of got lazy with their explanations. Yeah, they could have fudged the dates a little more to make it believable.
I mean, especially the things they were building during the Depression and during World War I, World War II, Civil War. It's like they ran out of years or something.
Right. This picture just made me laugh because I don't know if they meant to make it say late 19th century portrait by George Bradford Brainerd, but it's certainly not a portrait in my mind. That's a picture.
Like a photograph.
Right.
Again, it's interesting with the obelisk. I'm sure they were performing some kind of function on the energy grid also.
Right. So these two rooftops are in the side of a hillside kind of. So it's I didn't add the other pictures to it, but it was really strange with all the obelisks, and those are good sized buildings, and we're looking at like the top side to the roof, but it's a whole 2 or 3 story building that drops down in front of there.
Yeah, you see a lot of that with mud flooded places. It's like they built the buildings inside. It wasn't street level. It was below the street level or whatever perspective we're looking at it, because that looks like a wall, like a stone wall of some kind. Again, they just, when they came in, they did the reset, the resetters. And I see a boatload of secret societies besides the Freemasons, the Oddfellows, the Elks, the Knights of Pythias, and then there are others. And you can kind of identify them because they all have a logo of a handshake, like a fraternal handshake, secret handshake. And I think they were the ones that came in and cleaned things up so they could restart civilization after a cataclysm that caused the mud flood.
I've heard you talk about that, where it's almost like they either knew that the cataclysm was coming or it was intentionally caused. And not only was it intentionally caused, they already had a plan for digging back out, or they had a plan for resetting the civilization over here. And then obviously with our education system, it was all hush hush.
I know there's a variety of opinions on what happened, and that's where I land, that they caused it deliberately and ready to get things set up after it happened. But I think there was absolute premeditation to bring us the crazy upside down world that we are living in right now, which I don't think we're going to stay in. I'm an optimist. I think we're going to see some amazing things, but we were pretty darn close to them getting away with it. They were far advanced in their plans. And if what I believe is true, we're going to see changes sooner rather than later. I think good things are coming in, and they were so far advanced in their plans that if they had any time whatsoever, they would just keep moving forward. I don't think they're going to have that kind of momentum anymore. I think that's changed, and they're getting more exposed and people are becoming more aware and asking questions. So it's like a combination of things happening, but people waking up to this like you are is part of it. Asking questions, questioning the narrative. And that's why I always encourage people to don't just go with what we say or what I say or anybody else says. Do your own research, which is what you've done very well. And that's really what it takes, because when they set up the educational curriculum at the same time in the 1850s, and the Rockefellers were heavily involved in that, they removed critical thinking. They don't want us to think critically. They want us to be trained enough to become members of the workforce, to work in mills and factories and things like that. That's really all they wanted. And if, you aspired to more, they honor that. If you want to go into higher education and become a teacher or whatever, they don't mind that skill level. But by and large, their goal was just to produce workers that could follow direction directions and read well enough to do factory work and things like that.
Getting rid of critical thinking was the main objective or the main goal. And I feel like the collective awareness is a real thing, even if it's like a subconscious thing, even if someone's not going down these rabbit holes or thinking about stuff. The more people that are critically thinking, it somehow almost sheds to other people. It just seems like there's a momentum, like a snowball effect that seems to have been happening. It's definitely the last 4 years, but I'd say probably way before that.
It's everybody that's been putting out alternative ideas on the internet for some time. The early people that have been working on this, the Alex Joneses and the David Ikes and the Graham Hancocks and other people. And it doesn't matter if you agree with them or not. They were saying something that was different from what the narrative says. And you get the wheels turning. And for those of us looking for alternative information, myself included, before I started doing my own work, I was hungry for it myself. Couldn't get enough of hidden history and learning about megaliths and who were they and what was going on. And Graham Hancock was an early beacon for a lot of us because he published Fingerprints of the Gods, which was one of my early introductions to this. And I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. And, so they were like trailblazers. But I really see this as a grassroots effort made possible by the internet and YouTube and, again, the tools that we have at our disposal that we didn't before. And I never did anything like this until 2018 when I got the information that I'm sharing and started putting together what I was seeing and feeling like I needed to get it out there. And I haven't looked back and I haven't stopped. I just go deeper with it. So we're living in exciting and interesting times. And I'm definitely optimistic and not fearful that what they were trying to do is going to come to fruition. I think we're going to go in a different direction. But a big part of that is people waking up and the need for that.
I think that's why I like the whole reset theory thing the most. The monolithic structures from way ancient past is what caught our interest. But to me, the one that really can wake other people up is looking at what happened around the year 1900, going back to 1800. When we think about our great grandparents' generation, that's the easiest one for us to see what doesn't make sense and what does make sense. The easiest one for critical thinking to me, look at these buildings, look at what they told us in our history classes on what was really going on in early 1800, and then look at the oldest photos you can find. It's like, wait a minute. It seems like we were being lied to in our school system, and it's very obvious after, to me, not much looking at it, but obviously some people don't see it. But to me, that's the easiest gateway into understand, wait a minute.
Yeah, we have been, and if you're not ready for it, if somebody's not ready for it, it's just too much. It's just too much to handle. Again, the nice thing about the internet is people tend to find it when they're ready for it. And either they're going to resonate with it or not. If they're not going to resonate with it, they don't have to watch it or listen. Both ways, but I find more and more people are open to it, open to talking about it and open to thinking about it online, not necessarily in my everyday life.
So this is in Lowell, Massachusetts, and again, that archway entryway kind of caught my attention. This line reminded me of that Sphinx in Mount Auburn, which is in Massachusetts also, but this is in Lowell. But again, that's pretty similar size as that Sphinx in the very beginning slide.
There's a lion similar to that in a cemetery in Georgia, in Atlanta. The one I'm thinking of in Atlanta is almost identical to a lion that's in Switzerland that I've actually been to. So yeah, that seems pretty symbolic. And I'm sure there's a deeper meaning with the lion because that shows up a lot in old world type architecture and sculptures and things like that.
The next slide, it's of that lion, I believe, but it's just of the face, and to me, it's a very sad looking lion. To me, that whoever carved that was sad about what was going on. Lion is a sign of fierceness and strength. To me, that looks like a very sad face for a lion, not happy with what's going on with humanity.
It does. And that's another very realistic looking sculpture too, down to the
Yeah,
claws
the hair,
and the
mane,
hair.
everything.
The eyes, those eyes are so expressive.
Right. And usually if you're going to spend the amount of time to carve a lion, it's always a symbolic of strength and fierceness. But that is to me, it's whoever made that. And I don't know what these other markings that go along the base of it symbolize or whatever, but to me, the face of it is expressing sadness towards what's going on in the world.
Oh, it's that. That's the shh.
So that's in the same cemetery in Lowell, Massachusetts. And obviously that's out of copper.
So we've got this cowl going on here, and then this almost looks like a Roman breastplate and a rose and key. Is that a key?
Keys in the hand.
I think they're trying to tell us something there. John Ansley's story. Is that it?
Yeah, John Ansley's story. It seems like it has the dashes in between John and Ansley and story, funny enough. But yeah, symbolism and especially the finger, the old shush telltale sign. Again, these archways or gateways, which there's a couple in the cemeteries around where I live. I didn't even include pictures of it because I was staying focused on these early ones. But this one's in Syracuse, New York. So we're not in Lowell anymore, but obviously the lady has no head in this archway. And it has the wreath in the hand, or you might call it a crown. The interesting thing to me on this one, well, lots of interesting things, but I didn't notice it until after I put this in here, but there's almost like a little chemtrail going right through where the head is.
So they're telling us this was designed by Howard Daniels and built in 1859. During the rural cemetery fad, it was becoming a distinct landscape type and a good example of this kind of landscape architecture. And at one time, the original 92 acres or 37 hectares included about 60 acres or 24 hectares of dense oak forest with pine, ash, hickory, and maple. A crew of 60 laborers without large-scale earth-moving equipment thinned and grouped the trees. Today, there are many 150-year-old specimens. So it almost sounds like there was old growth there and they took it out and replanted.
Right. It kind of reminds me of the beginning with the Mount Auburn one where that pamphlet or whatever said for the benefit of strangers to see these stones with ease, or I forget how it was worded at the beginning there. But it reminded me of that, and then tying it back to the whole horticultural thing. And then what I was going to say about this one is the statue in the middle without the head on it looks like it's newer than the arch. It's like that was placed there after, and then someone decided to deface it by knocking the head off it afterwards. But that looks like two different structures to me. The arch is way more weathered. You can see the base of that statue of the person is different rock and not weathered as much.
So they would have added the name and then they would have added the engraving, which is easy enough to do. Easier to put up a plaque or engrave letters into stone than it is to actually build something like that. Lots of pyramids in these places, along with the cathedral.
I thought this was definitely interesting because if you look at the cornerstones on the whole pyramid one, those are solid blocks, not like they meet on the corner. So it's pretty obvious looking in that picture. And then this might be a little far-fetched, but you can tell at the top of the pyramid one, like a little cross type thing. And then you look at the top of the tower and there's like a little cross type thing. And if you look at the height of the tree that is going to the pyramid one, and then you look at the height of how tall that tree is next to the actual building beside it, it's actually kind of similar size as the peak of that tower compared to that pyramid. I'm not saying that there's a whole building underneath that, but I just thought that was kind of interesting how similar it was.
Looks like there's a lot going on here. There's whatever this is behind this one. They do look kind of similar. I mean, that's a pyramid with strange dimensions. Most of the ones we see are wider, so that does look like it could be something like that.
Yeah, definitely. The more that I look at the blocks on that pyramid, especially the cornerstones, you usually don't see like that many cornerstones that are all, sometimes it'd be like every other one is a real cornerstone, especially the one near the bottom is a pretty big stone.
That's a pretty sturdy bridge/archway there.
Seems like there was a lot more to that.
So I was talking about earthworks earlier. That's one of the things I think about when I see this here on the side. I mean, there could certainly be stones underneath that. It could have also been constructed that way. And then you can see the ground covering this part of the cemetery entrance, which is probably the result of covering it up, if that makes any sense. It wasn't built like that. Again, there's more underneath there.
Yeah, and just from one side to the other, you can tell that sides are the same, just one side still has the dirt and earth over it. You can tell by the base of one side of the arch.
They didn't build it like that. It was already built and earth shifted. Lots of examples of that. There's one off the top of my head in Pennsylvania, and they call it like a skewed bridge or a slanted bridge, something like that, where the bridge is there and the land is irregular around the location of that. And that's a better view of that other picture, right?
I'm not sure if it's the same one or not.
Yeah, I think it is, because you've got the cross up there.
And it reminds me of that pyramid type structure.
So this is the picture that's in your house.
So yeah, the top part is the same picture. I had to taken free, but that is the exact same building that's on the bottom there, Oxford University. But that's the funny part, is that on that lithograph, whatever you want to call it, it says Oxford University, founded in 1525. And then it says it was refounded by King Henry VIII, which I think you've talked about before. Some people say, does he exist or not? But on the same paintings, it said it was founded, refounded, and then refounded again. So it says King Henry VIII refounded it in 1532. And then it says King Henry VIII refounded it. He refounded it twice, 1532 and then 1546. And I thought that was hilarious. I found this painting at the dump in what we call the swap shop. Somebody put it in the swap shop, and there's a lot of symbols, or almost family crests, or what do you call them? Coat of arms. I was pretty new to the whole founded, understanding of what founded really meant when I grabbed this from the dump several years ago. And then when I read the bottom of that, I couldn't believe it. I forget it says first founded it, but it's Christ Church in Oxford University. Originally founded 1525, refounded by King Henry VIII in 1532, and then it goes on to say refounded by King Henry VIII in 1546. Out of all the things I've looked up, I've never seen anyone claim that they refounded something, let alone twice they refounded it. But it literally says refounded on this painting. I almost brought it with me today to have behind me because it's so funny to me. I've looked at it quite a bit, and going back to like what I was saying earlier with one of the first cemeteries, the big circle in the center of Oxford University, which I get that. If you're in a big complex, that's the best way to get from one part of the building to another. I just added that picture at the end of it because the whole founding versus founded, that is something that people should wrap their head around. What does founded really mean? And then to have them write founded and refounded on the actual painting is just so funny to me. I've tried to find a copy of that online, and I can't find one. I'm glad that somebody brought it to the dump and I scooped it up. I've looked at a lot of pictures, and it's basically the same. I didn't even put the best modern picture down at the bottom there, but the older one, the center top one, that's those little dots, that's like horse and buggy or horse and chariots. And so you look at how big that massive building is, and you see this all the time with old photos or old pictures, or at least depictions or whatever. It's like, why was such a huge thing built and you can only count like 12 or 20 people in the picture? So it's just a really good example of that. And you look at the date, we're usually talking about early 1800s to like 1900, but the fact that this is supposedly founded in 1525, just another example of the craziness.
Yeah, how crazy the narrative is. And King Henry VIII was a busy guy in our history. And so he was credited with building starports and this. But at the same time, so like between 1536 and 1541, under his orders, all of these monasteries were just being destroyed, called the dissolution of the monasteries. And there was a lot going on during that time. I don't think he's real. My personal opinion is that he's a fiction. My belief is before a certain point, history's fiction, and that at some point in time, and let's say the 1700s, lots starting to happen in the 1700s, the controllers wrote themselves into the history. But I think before that period of time, they were like laying the foundation and, maybe basing the characters on real people. But like King Henry VIII himself, I don't think he has any credibility in the narrative because of stuff like this. It's like what we were talking about with the architects with no experience that are given credit for these amazing buildings. Same thing. Right. He's like the architect with no experience that's given credit for all kinds of architecture. And like I said, at the same time, we're told he's giving the orders to tear down monasteries. So like Glastonbury, you go to Glastonbury and it's ruins. And supposedly it's in that shape because mobs are taking these monasteries apart. So on the one hand, massive public works projects credited to these guys. And then on the other hand, they're tearing stuff up. And I think he's a filler. I think he's like something to hang the narrative on. And I think the Jesuits and the Freemasons, I think there was a group of people that were rewriting history to explain these things. So we would be taught that in school so we wouldn't question what we're seeing. There very much seems to be a push with mainstream media that, oh no, you're not seeing what you're seeing. No, Summer of love, buildings burning everywhere. No, peaceful protest. Well, you have to be pretty programmed to believe that. That happened, 4 years ago? Cities are burning. Oh, no big deal here. There's a lot we've experienced just in the last few years that's very similar. No, believe what we tell you. Don't pay any attention to the evidence of your eyes. They've been gaslighting us on a lot of different levels about this. Our history, but also our present day world. So we've been through a lot. And in spite of everything that they've done to prevent us from waking up, it's happening anyway. So it's pretty exciting time.
Yeah, which is the beauty of it. Despite everything they threw at least the last few generations, several generations, who knows how long, but truth always prevails, I guess. Truther, almost a new term to me, like a few years ago. Admittedly told people, like, yeah, I'm into conspiracy theories, whatever, and a lot of people don't like conspiracy theories, but to me, the truther movement makes more sense to me. That's a better term for it, and I feel like truth is addicting once you start like going down the rabbit holes, which a lot of people consider to be conspiracy theories. It's more of like the more truth you find, the more addicted you get to it. And I didn't care about school in general for the most part, but when it came to U.S. history, it was almost like I knew that I was being lied to an extent. So I wasn't going to try to learn what they were telling me. But now I'm pretty sure I have a better understanding of U.S. history than any teacher that tried to teach it to me did. And I actually care more about it than probably any of my teachers. They were passionate about history, but I don't think they really understood.
And I loved history in school, and I'm glad I didn't major in it. I thought about it, but I needed to major in a field where I could get a job right away. And I knew with history, there wasn't much I could do about it. But now I look at it as that just gave me a good basis for what the narrative says. So I know where to look for certain things when I do research. But it's blatant. Things that we're talking about, you just have to read, look, see what's there, read what they tell us about it, and know there's something that's really off in the narrative. And they count on us not figuring that out. Go to the movies or go to the ball game or go out and party with your friends. They're perfectly happy with nobody paying attention. And they've got away with it for a long time. And maybe things just had to get so crazy, in the official narrative, so weird. And again, I'll use present day events as supporting that. It had to get to the extreme before people really started to pay attention.
No, I've heard that before. People have said that things are going to have to get really bad before people really start to wake up. And to me, things are bad. Luckily, they haven't gone terrible, but it's amazing how many people see through the bull now. I think it's very encouraging and positive, and like I was saying earlier, like even just collectively, even the people that don't fully see it or even care to look into this stuff, they're starting to get it. They're starting to, I feel like subliminally, people are starting to understand that even if they haven't spent years looking into this stuff, like they know not to trust, just collectively, that they don't trust anything, or they're more willing to listen to a conspiracy theory, I guess you might call it,
The momentum is definitely building. And when, say the last 4 years, when there's agendas that are being shoved down people's throats that are going WTF, and they stop buying certain products, beer and, other things, when spokespeople show up promoting an agenda that most people don't agree with, but they have to see that happening first. If there's no stress, there's no change. And so we seem to be in the middle of a period like that. And I think we're closer to the other side of this than we were. I've been awake for quite some time, so this is taking way too long for me.
That's how I feel. It's going too slow. A few years ago, especially, I was like, just let's get on with it, Let it get really bad because I want people to really see it quickly, because I'm sick of watching the slow totalitarian tiptoe, some people will call it.
And that's what's going on. I mean, they call it boiling frogs.
I kind of wish we could jump ahead 7 years and see what comes out the other side, but I'm definitely more positive about what's going on. I was a little more pessimistic 2021, 2022. I gotta wait 8 more years to see what the hell happens, but things still aren't great right now. It's still going way too slow for me. It's the powers that be, or the people that were trying to send us in a certain direction. Once again, they underestimated the power of people, of humanity.
They can't figure us out. They don't have what we have. It's like they have one playbook. They only have one play in their playbook, and they play it well, but they don't understand us. And There was a meme I came across a couple of years ago called "They Thought They Could Bury Us, but They Didn't Realize We Were Seeds." That really resonated with me, that whole idea. There's way more resilience and love and caring and compassion in the human spirit.
I love it when you say at the end of some of your videos, you're like, they lost the narrative and they're not going to get away with it. And sometimes you say it in a very powerful way. And I love it. I get chills sometimes and I'm like, go Michelle, freaking let them know. Let them know they lost the narrative, because some people are afraid to say that, or people say it in different ways, but I think that's really where they lost it. You could say because of the internet or whatever, but they lost the narrative. They could have gotten away with this without the internet, and they did to an extent for a long time, but too many people have woken up to what's going on. It's impressive to me. 60 years ago, if I was in this mindset, I would have been like, yeah, we're screwed. But I think even if it's past my lifetime, the good of humanity is going to prevail, and they screwed up.
And I do believe that sincerely. I do believe that they're not going to get away with what they've done, and that the power of the human spirit is stronger, and people just need to know. I mean, their only hope was to convince us that they were all powerful and we weren't. That was it. That's why they've thrown so much at us. They had to keep us from waking up. Well, they haven't succeeded in that. We are waking up anyway. It's an exciting time to be alive, so we'll see how things unfold, but I am optimistic. And I really appreciate your taking the time to put the presentation together and talk to me tonight. And I would like to do it again. You sent me quite a bit of information that is very tantalizing, things that I would not have thought to look at, like the Shackleton expedition and standardized testing and things like that. I'm the world's worst standardized test taker. I do not do well with standardized tests. I'm a good student, but don't stick a test where they want you to give them a predetermined answer. I'm not any good at that. Well, thank you again for your time, Hans, and let's do it again sometime.
Thank you, big time.
You're welcome. You're doing a great job with this. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you.